Question number 2 is Reza owns a large retail business. As the business has many credit customers and credit suppliers, she was advised to maintain purchase ledger and sales ledger control accounts. Then part A is written like this. Explain 2 benefits of maintaining control accounts. Well, this is a 4-mark question, and remember that 1 mark is for identifying the benefit and 1 mark is for the development. I mean, a brief explanation of that benefit. Understand? If your first benefit is like this, they provide an arithmetical check on the accuracy of the purchases and sales ledger. Then for its development, I mean, the short explanation you would write because they enable any errors to be discovered quickly. Is that clear? And if your second benefit is they assist in the preparation of trial balances and financial statements, then for its development you would write because the totals of trades payable and trades receivables can be found quickly. I hope you have understood this. And the mark distribution in the mark scheme is something like this. On the next page, additional information is given. Reza decides to maintain control accounts as a part of double entry system. Then it is written, on 1 January 2025, the balance of the purchases ledger control account agreed with the total of balances in the purchases ledger of 23,420. Then below this, a summary of transactions for January 2025 is given, and part B is written, prepare the purchases ledger control account for January 2025. You know very well that on the debit side of the purchases ledger control account, all those accounts are written that cause a decrease in the business liability. And on the credit side, all those accounts are written that cause an increase in the business liability. Another important point is that the amounts in the purchases ledger control account come from the purchases daybook, purchases returns daybook, and the cash book. And specifically from the cash book, only the relevant amounts for discount received and cash paid are transferred here. Since 1 January 2025 is the opening date, and on this opening date, the purchases ledger control account and the purchases ledger balances agree. This means that this amount of 23,420 will be written as the opening balance on the credit side of the purchases ledger control account. Is that correct? Then the amount of payments to credit suppliers causes a decrease in the business liability, which is why it is written on the debit side of this control account. Since this amount comes from the cash book, we write bank here and write down its amount. At the time of making payment, discount received occurs. The business liability has decreased. So this is also written on the debit side. So here we write discount received and write down its amount. The situation of a refund from a credit supplier resulting from an overpayment confuses some students. A refund from a credit supplier resulting from an overpayment at least confirms that the business made a payment to its supplier, for which you will debit the supplier's personal account and credit the cash account. The supplier is debited because the business liability has decreased, and since cash being an asset decreases, it is credited. Because the payment was made slightly in excess, this same creditor, the supplier, becomes a temporary debtor of the business. And when they refund the amount, you would definitely debit the cash account and credit the supplier's personal account. And you already know that the purchases ledger control account is primarily updated from the purchases journal, purchases return journal, and the cash book. However, from this journal entry, it is clear that this entry has been recorded in the relevant supplier's personal account in the purchases ledger and in the cash book. Therefore, this refund amount will not be reflected in the purchases ledger control account from the supplier's personal account. Instead, this refund amount will be reflected on the credit side of the purchases ledger control account. So on the credit side, we write bank and write down its amount. Contra with the sales ledger represents a situation where the business customer is also at the same time its supplier, meaning the business has to receive money from Mr. A and also has to pay money to Mr. A. Contra with sales ledger means the business liability has decreased, which is why we write it on the debit side. So let's write contra with sales ledger and write down its amount. Then it is written interest charged by a credit supplier on an overdue account. When the business delays payment to its credit supplier, the payment becomes overdue. Then the supplier charges interest, and along with the original amount, this interest also has to be paid. Due to the overdue amount, the business liability increases, which is why this will be written on the credit side here. So here we write interest charged and write down its amount. Then it is written purchases general 22,711. This is a very simple matter. This is the total of the purchases general, meaning the credit purchases, which indicates that the business liability has increased. Therefore, this will be written on the credit side. So let's write credit purchases here and write down its amount. Then it is written purchases returns general. This is also a very simple matter because this is the total of the purchases returns, which indicates that the business liability has decreased. Therefore, this will be written on the debit side. So let's write purchases returns here and write down its amount. I hope you have understood this, and the mark distribution in the mark scheme is something like this. On the next page, additional information is given. It is written on 31 January 2025, the total of the balances in the sales ledger was 17,180. However, the balance on the sales ledger control account was different. The following errors have been discovered which account for this difference. So we have received this information that the sales ledger balance and the sales ledger control account balance are not the same. And then after these three errors, part C is written, calculate an amended figure for each of the following. First, let's determine the sales ledger total of balances. The original total of the sales ledger is already given, which is 17,180. And you already know that by default, this is a debit balance. Now let's see which errors need to be adjusted here. Error number one is the balance of sales ledger control account had been miscalculated. The total of the debit entries was 82,490 and the total of the credit entries was 65,550. So the difference between the debit side entries and the credit side entries is 16,940, and this is a debit balance. However, this relates to the sales ledger control account, not the sales ledger total of balances. But below, they have asked to find the amended figure for the sales ledger control account balance as well. So let's write this here. Is that correct? Let's write balance and write the debit amount next to it. Then error number 2 is written, the total of discounts allowed column in the cash book had been undercast by $90. The total of the discounts allowed column in the cash book is written in the sales ledger control account. Discount allowed is actually written on the credit side of the sales ledger control account to indicate a decrease in receivables. If this total itself is undercast in the cash book, it means that an undercast amount, the lesser amount, was written on the credit side of the sales ledger control account. Therefore, $90 needs to be credited. Let's write discount allowed and write the amount next to it. Then error number 3 is written, a credit note issued to a credit customer for $120 had been correctly entered in the book of prime entry, but had been debited to the account of customer as $210. Well, the statement a credit note is issued to a credit customer for $120 had been correctly entered in the books of prime entry means that this error at the very least does not affect the sales ledger control account. Okay, but the part says that but had been debited to the account of the customer as $210 reveals two errors here. Firstly, the customer should have been credited but instead was debited. Secondly, the amount should have been $120 but $210 was written. Since the customer has been incorrectly debited by $210, so to cancel this effect, we will credit it by $210, and since 120 should have been credited, we will also credit $120. So the total credit will be $330. Since the original total is already a default debit balance and this 330 is a credit, so subtracting these two gives an amount of 16,850. Next to it, we write corrected total of balances. Now let's come to the sales ledger control account balance. This is a debit balance of 16,940 and below we have a credit of $90 written. Therefore, subtracting these two gives an amount of 16,850 and this is a debit balance. Next to it, we write corrected balance. It is an accounting rule that the control account and the total of individual accounts should always be equal. Since these two amounts match, it means the books are now correct and no other errors remain. I hope you have understood this, and the mark distribution in the mark scheme is something like this.